What started as a routine celebrity interview exploded into television chaos when Jimmy Kimmel's relentless questioning pushed Brad Pitt to his breaking point, culminating in an on-air meltdown that left audiences stunned and the entertainment world reeling. Kimmel opened with his characteristic smirk, welcoming Pitt with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "Brad Pitt, everybody! Thanks for being here, man. You look great, considering everything you've been through lately." The comment hung in the air with an undertone that made Pitt's smile falter slightly, though he maintained his composure with practiced Hollywood grace. The first few minutes proceeded normally enough. They discussed Pitt's latest film project, his production company, and his recent philanthropic endeavors. Pitt appeared relaxed, even charming, as he regaled the audience with behind-the-scenes stories and self-deprecating humor. The crowd laughed at all the right moments, and social media began lighting up with clips of the interview's lighter moments. But something shifted in Kimmel's demeanor as the commercial break ended. His questions became more pointed, more personal. "So Brad, let's talk about your personal life for a minute. You've had quite the journey with relationships, haven't you? Some might say you have a pattern of jumping from one high-profile relationship to another." Pitt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his media training kicked in. "Jimmy, I think that's a pretty reductive way to look at anyone's personal life. We're all just trying to find happiness and connection, you know?" Kimmel leaned forward, his smile becoming more predatory than friendly. "Right, but come on, Brad. Jennifer Aniston, Angelina Jolie. There's always been this narrative about you being the guy who can't commit, or maybe commits too quickly to the wrong people. What do you think about that?" The audience grew uncomfortably quiet, sensing the shift in tone. Pitt's publicist, visible in the wings, looked increasingly concerned as she watched her client's face begin to redden. "I think that's between me and the people involved, Jimmy. I'm here to talk about my work." But Kimmel wasn't backing down. In fact, he seemed energized by Pitt's discomfort. "Oh, but your work and your personal life are pretty intertwined, aren't they? I mean, you met Angelina on a movie set while you were still married to Jennifer. That must have been complicated." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Pitt's hands, which had been casually resting on the chair's armrests, now gripped them tightly. "Jimmy, I think we should move on to something else. This isn't really appropriate." Kimmel's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Inappropriate? Brad, you're one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Your personal life has been tabloid fodder for 20 years. Surely you can handle a few questions about relationships that were already public knowledge." "There's a difference between public knowledge and respect," Pitt replied, his voice taking on an edge that longtime fans had rarely heard. "Just because something happened in public doesn't mean it needs to be dissected for entertainment." The host's eyes gleamed with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "Respect? That's interesting coming from someone who allegedly had anger issues during his marriage. I mean, the custody battle with Angelina got pretty messy, didn't it? There were some serious allegations thrown around." The studio fell into dead silence. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Pitt's face had gone from red to pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the chair. "Jimmy, you need to stop. Right now." But Kimmel pressed on, apparently intoxicated by the drama he was creating. "I'm just asking questions that millions of people are thinking. You put yourself out there as this reformed guy, this spiritual person who's learned from his mistakes, but actions have consequences, don't they? Your kids certainly think so, considering how often they see you these days." That was the moment everything changed. Pitt's composure, carefully maintained through decades of interviews and public scrutiny, finally cracked. He stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with enough force that it nearly toppled over. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The audience gasped collectively, some pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a historic television moment. Kimmel, rather than backing down or attempting to defuse the situation, seemed to revel in having finally gotten under his guest's skin. "Hit a nerve, did I?" Kimmel said with a cruel smile. "Look, Brad, I get it. Nobody likes having their failures aired out in public. But you can't come on television and expect everyone to just pretend like your personal life doesn't exist. You're not just an actor anymore. You're a brand. And part of that brand is the drama." Pitt took a step closer to Kimmel's desk and, for a moment, the host's bravado faltered slightly. The security team, usually invisible during tapings, began moving closer to the stage. "My children are not part of any brand," Pitt said, each word carefully enunciated and dripping with barely controlled fury. "And you just crossed a line that you can't uncross." The studio atmosphere had become electric with tension, the kind of raw energy that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Kimmel, however, seemed incapable of reading the room, or perhaps simply addicted to the power he felt in this moment. Instead of apologizing or attempting to redirect the conversation, he doubled down with a smugness that bordered on sociopathic. "Oh, come on, Brad," Kimmel said, leaning back in his chair with theatrical casualness. "Don't get all righteous with me. You're the one who chose to have your personal drama play out in courtrooms and tabloids. I'm just commenting on what's already out there. Besides, isn't this better than those softball interviews you usually do?" Finally, some real conversation. The audience had gone beyond uncomfortable silence into genuine shock. Many were no longer recording with excitement, but with the morbid fascination of witnessing a car crash in slow motion. Pitt's hands were visibly shaking now, not with fear, but with the effort of maintaining control over emotions that clearly wanted to explode outward. "Real conversation?" Pitt's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried more menace than if he had been shouting. "You think exploiting someone's pain for cheap laughs is real conversation? You think ambushing a guest with personal attacks is journalism?" Kimmel's producer, visible in the control booth, was frantically gesturing for a commercial break, but Kimmel ignored the signals completely. He was too intoxicated by the drama to let it go. "Look, I'm not trying to hurt you, Brad, but you can't come on my show and expect me to treat you like some untouchable celebrity. You're just a guy who happens to be famous. And guys make mistakes. Big ones, apparently." "Just a guy?" Pitt repeated, his voice gaining volume and an edge that made several audience members visibly flinch. "You're right about one thing, Jimmy. I am just a guy. A guy who's made mistakes, who's trying to do better, who's working every day to be the best father he can be despite circumstances you know nothing about. But you? What are you? A talk show host who gets his kicks from humiliating people who trust you enough to sit in that chair." The color had drained from Kimmel's face, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. If anything, Pitt's words seemed to infuriate him further. "Trust? You came here to promote a movie, Brad. This is business, and part of that business is answering questions that people want answers to. I'm not your therapist or your friend. I'm a host doing my job." "Your job?" Pitt's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Your job is to entertain people, not to destroy them. There's a difference between tough questions and character assassination. What you're doing right now isn't hosting. It's bullying with an audience." The tension in the room was palpable. Now. Security guards had moved even closer, though they seemed uncertain about how to handle a situation involving two high-profile public figures. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most explosive celebrity confrontations in television history. Kimmel stood up from behind his desk, his own composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of Pitt's accusations and the obvious disapproval of everyone around him. "Bullying? I'm asking legitimate questions about your public behavior. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews at all." "Maybe I shouldn't," Pitt shot back. "Maybe I should have listened to the people who warned me about what kind of person you really are behind that fake smile and those scripted jokes. They told me you had a mean streak, but I thought they were exaggerating. I thought you were just playing a character." The insult hit its mark. Kimmel's face flushed red, and for the first time in the interview he looked genuinely angry rather than smugly entertained. "Character? Everything I do up here is real, Brad. Unlike some people, I don't hide behind publicists and image consultants. I say what I think." "What you think?" Pitt stepped even closer to the desk, close enough that Kimmel instinctively leaned back. "What you think is that it's okay to use someone's personal pain as entertainment. What you think is that having a platform gives you the right to be cruel. Well, let me tell you what I think, Jimmy. I think you're a small, petty man who gets off on making others feel as miserable as you clearly are inside." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The audience gasped collectively, some covering, their mouths in shock at witnessing such a brutal character assassination delivered with surgical precision. Kimmel's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, hurt, and then a rage so pure it was almost frightening to witness. "Miserable." Kimmel's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, the facade of professional composure completely shattered. "You want to talk about miserable? I'm not the one who destroyed 2 marriages because I couldn't keep it in my pants. I'm not the one whose own children won't speak to him. At least when I screw up, I don't blame everyone else for pointing it out." The studio had become a pressure cooker of tension. Camera operators continued filming, but several looked visibly uncomfortable capturing what was clearly personal destruction, happening in real time. The audience members were no longer entertained spectators, but unwilling witnesses to something that felt too intimate and too brutal for public consumption. Pitt's entire body went rigid at the mention of his children. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet, the kind of calm that precedes a hurricane. "You want to keep talking about my kids, Jimmy? Let's talk about how you just used them as weapons on national television. Let's talk about how you just tried to hurt a father by weaponizing his relationship with his children for laughs." "I didn't say anything that wasn't already in the tabloids," Kimmel shot back, but there was a defensive edge to his voice now, as if he was beginning to realize he might have gone too far. "I'm just asking the questions everyone's thinking." "No," Pitt said, his finger now pointing directly at Kimmel's chest. "You're not asking questions. You're making statements. You're passing judgment. You're taking the most painful parts of someone's life and turning them into punchlines. That's not journalism, Jimmy. That's sadism." The accusation of sadism seemed to trigger something primal in Kimmel. His professional mask didn't just slip, it completely disintegrated. "Sadism? You're calling me a sadist?" Rich coming from someone who allegedly had anger management issues. "Tell me, Brad, is this what your ex-wife was talking about? Is this the temper that scared your kids?" The studio fell into absolute silence. Even the camera operators stopped moving. Security guards tensed, ready to intervene if the situation escalated to physical confrontation. Pitt's face had gone completely white, and for a moment everyone present wondered if they were about to witness something truly ugly. But instead of exploding, Pitt did something unexpected. He laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound that somehow conveyed more contempt than any shouting could have. "There it is," he said, nodding slowly. "There's the real Jimmy Kimmel. Not the charming late-night host, not the comedian, but the bitter little man who gets his rocks off by trying to break people." "I'm not trying to break anyone," Kimmel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm doing my job." "Your job?" Pitt's voice rose for the first time since the confrontation began. "Your job is to make people laugh, to bring a little joy into their lives at the end of a hard day. Instead, you're using your platform to spread cruelty and pain. You're taking someone's worst moments and making them worse for entertainment. How do you sleep at night?" Kimmel's hands were shaking now, whether from anger or something else entirely. "Don't you dare lecture me about my job. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've interviewed thousands of celebrities, and somehow you're the only one who can't handle a few tough questions." "Tough questions?" Pitt's voice dripped with disbelief. Jimmy, asking about my work is a tough question. Asking about my creative process is a tough question. What you did was character assassination disguised as an interview. You ambushed me with personal attacks and then acted surprised when I defended myself. The control room was in chaos. Producers were screaming at each other about whether to cut to commercial, whether to end the show entirely, whether this disaster could somehow be salvaged. But Kimmel, completely ignoring all signals from his team, pressed on with what appeared to be a death wish for his own career. Defended yourself? Kimmel's laugh was harsh and mocking. You haven't defended anything. You've just thrown a tantrum because someone finally called you out on your behavior. This is exactly what everyone's been saying about you, Brad. You can't handle criticism. You can't handle accountability. Accountability? Pitt's voice rose to match Kimmel's intensity. You want to talk about accountability? Then let's talk about yours. You just spent the last 10 minutes trying to humiliate a guest on your show. For ratings, you used my children as ammunition in your pathetic attempt to create drama. And now you're trying to justify it by calling it accountability? The two men were now facing each other across the desk like gladiators in an arena. Neither willing to back down, both too invested in the conflict to find a way out. The audience watched in horrified fascination as two grown men destroyed each other's reputations in real time. Kimmel, perhaps sensing that he had already gone too far to retreat, decided to go for the nuclear option. You know what, Brad? Maybe your kids are better off without you around. Maybe they're lucky they don't have to deal with this, he gestured wildly at Pitt. Whatever this is, on a daily basis. The words hit the studio like a physical force. Several audience members audibly gasped, and one woman in the front row actually stood up as if to leave. The cameramen exchanged horrified glances, understanding they were capturing something that would haunt both men's careers forever. Even the security guards, trained to remain impassive, looked shocked at the viciousness of the attack. For a moment, Pitt stood completely still, his face a mask of controlled fury that was somehow more terrifying than any explosion of anger could have been. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the microphones barely picked it up. But the silence in the studio meant every word carried with crystalline clarity. "Congratulations, Jimmy," Pitt said, his tone conversational, but his eyes burning with an intensity that made Kimmel instinctively step backward. You just said something so unforgivably cruel that there's no coming back from it. You just crossed the one line that no decent human being ever crosses. You used my children, to try to hurt me on national television. Kimmel's face had gone pale as the reality of what he'd said began to sink in. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked genuinely frightened, not just of Pitt, but of what he had become in this moment. Brad, I was just... What? Pitt cut him off, his voice gaining strength and moral authority. Just being a bully? Just being cruel? Just forgetting that there are actual human beings involved in the stories you tell for laughs? My children, Jimmy. You just told a national television audience that my children are better off without their father. Think about that. Think about what kind of person says that. The studio had become a tomb. Not a single person moved or spoke. Even the producers in the control room had gone silent, understanding that they were witnessing career suicide in real time, but not knowing whose career was being destroyed. Kimmel tried to regain his footing, but his voice was shaky and uncertain. Look, Brad, maybe I went a little too far, but you're the one who started throwing personal insults. You called me petty and miserable. I called you petty and miserable because of how you were acting, Pitt replied, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. But you just attacked my relationship with my children. You just suggested that innocent kids are better off without their father. Do you understand the difference? Do you understand what you just did? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had finally pushed too far, said something so inexcusably cruel that even his own ego couldn't find a way to justify it. Pitt straightened his jacket with deliberate calm, his movements precise and controlled. "I've been in this business for 30 years, Jimmy. I've dealt with aggressive interviewers, hostile journalists, and people who wanted to hurt me professionally. But I've never encountered someone who would use my children as weapons just to create a moment for television." He turned to address the audience directly, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. "I want everyone here to understand what just happened. This man," he pointed at Kimmel without looking at him, "just told you that my children are better off without their father. Not because he knows anything about my family, not because he has any insight into our lives, but because he thought it would make good television." The audience remained silent, but many were nodding in agreement. Several people were actively recording on their phones, capturing what was clearly a defining moment in television history. Pitt turned back to Kimmel, who was now visibly sweating and looking around desperately for some kind of escape from the situation he had created. "I'm done here, Jimmy. I'm done with this interview, I'm done with this show, and I'm done pretending that what you just did was anything other than cruel and unprofessional." "Brad, wait," Kimmel called out, his voice now pleading rather than aggressive. "We can work this out. We can talk about this like adults." Pitt paused at the edge of the stage, turning back one final time. "Adults, Jimmy? Adults don't use other people's children to score points in an argument. Adults don't turn personal pain into entertainment. Adults take responsibility for their actions instead of doubling down on cruelty." With that, Brad Pitt walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a panicked production crew, and a host who finally understood that he had just destroyed his own reputation on live television. The camera held on Kimmel's face for several long seconds, capturing the exact moment when the reality of his actions hit him fully. As Pitt disappeared through the backstage exit, the studio remained in absolute silence. Kimmel stood alone behind his desk, no longer the confident host who had started the interview, but a man who had revealed something ugly about himself to millions of viewers, and would spend years trying to explain away a moment of cruelty that could never be taken back.